Good evening. This is the 13th Trust Barometer that we've produced. It was born a little bit earlier in 1999. You're probably all too young, but in that year there was an event called the Battle of Seattle. The Battle of Seattle was the World Trade Organization meeting that took place in Seattle. And if you do remember, we witnessed students in the streets fighting police with tear gas in what became one of the first big demonstrations against globalization. And our boss, Richard Edelman, was watching this on his TV screens, and he believed that something at that time had broken down in trust between business and between global society, consumers and NGOs. And at that point, he embarked on the trust study. Is that right? The trust study is the largest piece of data in the public relations industry. The instrument I will take you through today is a survey in 26 countries of 31,000 respondents. There are two parts to the trust study. The purple badge at the top is the data that I will refer to most of the time. That's informed publics. In every country that we do this is the top 25% of wage earners. They have a higher propensity to read media. They are opinion formers, if you like. Where you see the orange badge, that's general population. We will make some market comparisons. So where we talk about developed, it's US, UK, France, Germany, and Japan. Where we talk about emerging, it's Brazil, Mexico, Russia, India, and China. And these are the countries in APAC that we've done. So that's the boring technical stuff out of the way. The history of the Trust Barometer. First thing we learned in 2001 was the rising influence of NGOs in its most violent, as witnessed by the Battle of Seattle. Arguably the most important 2 years for the Trust Barometer were 2005 and 2006, because at that time we really began to see the effect of the infinite capability of search for anybody to discover anything about anyone or anything at any time and become expert. And in 2006, a person like me, because at that time as well, with the emergence of social media, people could come together in community. So individuals could become very expert by using search, and they could come together via social media in community and exert pressure. And so that people like me became a much more credible source of information in that year, in those 2 years. That was sort of the period of democratization of trust. A couple of other landmarks. 2009, business lost the right to lead. We had Lehman's, we had the crash, the financial crash, and not surprising, business lost trust. A couple of years later, in 2012, after the years of witnessing the European governments struggling to dissolve the euro crisis, and I guess in the US we had the Republicans and the Democrats not being able to agree about anything really, and the fiscal cliff, and we've had that recently. Also, government lost a lot of trust. This year, our theme is the crisis of leadership. That's what we've discovered this year. Globally, there is a crisis of leadership. Interestingly, in Japan, it's not so much a crisis of leadership, it's just a crisis of trust. And we've some fairly shocking data to show you on this. So I'm going to take you through three elements today: the state of trust generally, the crisis of leadership, and what we believe is the path forward. This is a very complicated slide, and I'm going to direct you, if I can, to 2013. This is an aggregate score of how people in each of these countries trust the four institutions of those countries. And for us, the four institutions are business, media, NGOs, and government. And we take the score of do you trust those institutions to do what is right, add them up, divide by 4, and we come to this league table. So the countries that are in blue are broadly the trusting countries. The countries that are in red are distrusting, and grey neutral in the middle. So 2013, the most trusting country is China, and I'll come on to talk about that in a minute. Of the top 9, 6 are developing economies. One of the things that we've discovered about trust over time is that if an economy is getting better, if people's lives are getting better, if their children are perceived to have more options than they did, they ascribe the institutions that surround them with trust. And of course, the opposite is true. So you'll see many of the European countries whose economies have struggled in the lower trusting segment. In the middle here, this year overall, we've seen a bit of a rebound in trust. If you compare the score for 2013, 57 versus 51, that was a rebound in trust, admittedly from a low point. And some of the bigger rebounds have been the two big European countries, France and Germany, and the US. In all of those markets, with France and Germany in Europe particularly, the worst of the euro crisis was seen to have been averted, or hoped to have been averted. Greece didn't bring Europe down. And in the US, I think we had the seeds of economic recovery. Now, you've probably noticed already where Japan is. So I'll direct you to the red zone, the distrusting nations. And here you can see Japan is second to bottom in terms of trust. This to us is surprising. What was not surprising was the year before. The year before was the first time that we had done the study after 3/11. And it was not surprising, given the reaction to 3/11, that the institutions that were directing the recovery from that suffered in trust terms. For us, what is interesting this year is that there has been no rebound, or very small rebound, in trust in Japan of the four institutions. And I will unpack that a little bit in a minute. If we compare the general public with the informed public, you'll see that the general public are slightly more skeptical, and the same is true of Japan. So when you ask people, do you trust the institutions to do what is right, the general population in Japan, you get a figure of 35. 35% of people believe that the institutions, the four institutions, do what is right in Japan. That is one of the lowest figures we have ever had for this vehicle anywhere in the world. I'm going to break that out now by those four institutions. So the green is last year, the blue is this year. Trust in government, business, media, NGOs. Business is the most trusted, media second most trusted, NGOs third, and government the least trusted institution. There has, as you can see there, been a bit of a bounce, but it's a small bounce. The grey bar in there indicates that actually that bounce is quite weak. That is the answer to the question, do you trust a great deal those institutions? And that's very low. So the recovery is very small, and it's very weak in trust. Interestingly, the order of these institutions is different in Japan to other markets. NGOs in most markets are the most trusted institution. That's not the case here in Japan. This chart, global is the light blue, APAC is the dark blue, and Japan is the grey. This is the amount of the bounce, the recovery in trust we've had this year from the low of last year. And here you can see fairly plainly, both for general population and for general opinion formers, that that was a very shallow bounce in Japan compared to our region and compared to the global average. This is the same chart, but mapped over time. And this is for opinion formers again. So this is for those four institutions mapped over time. Last year, when we presented the data in the wake of 3/11, we had the cataclysma of trust in Japan. Trust was taken away from all of the institutions because of the way in which they were perceived to have led or not led the recovery after the disaster. And here you can see that there has been a bounce, but it's a shallow one. Business is a significant leader, and government is a significant trailer. Another complicated slide. This is trust across the world in the two institutions of business and government. And we've put them together to see how they relate to each other in each of these countries. So crudely, the countries on the left are the countries where business has a right to lead, or an opportunity to lead. The countries on the right are where government is more trusted. And arguably, if you're in business, they possibly have a license to regulate and get involved in business in ways they don't to countries on the left. Japan here, you can see, is pretty much in the middle, but there is a big gap between trust in business and trust in government. Trust in business is much higher here. This next question also shows a difference in Japan. This is the global chart. When we looked at trust in business, we asked the people who said they did not trust business to do what is right, and we asked them why, or at least we gave them 5 reasons as to why that might be. Globally, corruption or fraud, wrong incentives are the 2 most important reasons why people don't trust business. For government, it's corruption or fraud, wrong incentives, and performance or competence. But look at those 50% for the top figures. Now compare that to Japan, and it's a very different picture. So, whilst a lot more people don't trust business in Japan compared to some other markets, it's not because of wrong incentives or corruption or fraud. It's a competence issue. And look at the competence issue for government. So people don't believe their government is corrupt in Japan. That's not the reason trust has gone away. It's a pure competence issue. Very different in Japan. We haven't seen this to this extent anywhere else. Trust in business is one thing as an institution. How does it stack up by the different sectors? This is a global chart. This is last year in green, this year in blue. Every year that we've done this, technology has always been the most trusted institution. Partly we think this is because it's got visionary leaders who talk about a wonderful vision and future for the world. Partly because probably the technology and products work a lot better than they used to. Globally, the interesting thing, I think, has been the fact that the last few years, banks and financial services have been the least trusted institutions. Well, we've had the global financial crash, we had the Lehman scandal, 2009. It's not improved through the bonus scandals in Europe and the US, and recently the Libor scandal. So, globally, banking and financial services have been the least trusted. Again, Japan is very different. Let's have a look at Japan. Banking and financial services are not nearly as badly positioned in the competitive set here. You haven't had the same banking scandals as the US and particularly the UK have had. In fact, that's true throughout Asia-Pac. Do you trust banks and financial services to do what is right? No country in Asia-Pac is below 50%. So there's no crisis of trust in banks and financial services in our region. But look at energy here. Look at energy last year for Japan, TEPCO, after the disaster. We have had a recovery here. And look at some of the differences between the global numbers, which are helpfully put here on the bar on the right. Industries like pharmaceuticals are much better regarded here in Japan than they are in other markets, even though business as a whole is trusted less. So that's quite a differential. The pharma industry is in a good position here compared to globally. This is by those industries over time, and the reason that we just put this one here is just to look at the 2 industries that suffered most from the disaster from 3/11. Energy, not surprisingly, but also media. This is media as an industry suffered as well. Now, there's been a bounce back to some degree from both, but media remains as an industry the least trusted sector here. And we were discussing this with the panel before. I'll be interested to hear views on that from the panel in a moment. This is banking again. This is trust in banking around the world. 2008 is the orange bar. This year is the blue bar. If you're a banker, don't go to Europe. You're not welcome. You're not trusted. You are probably going to get invited out if you go out in Asia Pacific. And Japan here, there is no crisis of banking in Japan. A little more optimistic. I was always nervous coming to a country and telling you that nobody here trusts anybody. So this is a little more optimistic. This is, do you trust companies headquartered in these countries to do what is right? And this is the global number for that. So this, if you like, is a league table, global league table of how the world trusts companies from these countries. And here you can see that Japan is in pretty good shape. Your middle to left-hand side here, up with some of the best in the world. Interestingly, Germany, Canada, Sweden always seem to end up high on this. And Germany, just like Japan, has low domestic trust in business and high external trust in business. Germans don't trust their business, just like Japanese don't trust theirs that highly, and yet internationally that's the case. The interesting mover this year is South Korea, which has gone from the more developed to the developing to the developed. Hyundai, Samsung, all of these brands have been around and have proven themselves as global competitors, and that's had a big effect on that economy. Bit more optimism. We looked now at how Japanese headquartered companies were trusted in developed and emerging countries. And here you can see that there is an opportunity. If you think that some of the big investment prizes exist in the developing economies, you can see that, in fact, Japanese companies are pretty well positioned in terms of trust in that regard. So that's a point of optimism. This is the same question. Do you trust companies headquartered in these countries, but in Japan? So this is Japanese opinion formers' answer to the same question. And the interesting thing here, I think, is the far thing on the left. So for years, I've certainly been told that Japanese prefer Japanese companies because they understand Japan and they're perceived to be higher quality than foreign companies. Well, this year, for the first time, we've got erosion in the Japanese premium of trust in Japanese companies. And that, you could argue, spells opportunity for foreign companies here and possibly some trouble for local companies. If you look to the far right, you'll see in Japan the influence of geopolitics. Look at the countries that are least, or companies from countries that are least trusted here. And it's got something to do with islands in the South China Sea, I guess. You'll see Japan. This is trust in Japanese companies in individual countries around the world now. And you can see that some of the reverse is true. So in South Korea, there's been a big drop in trust in Japanese companies. But given that you guys scored them at 3%, that's probably not a bad score. Interesting, I think, that your companies are trusted very much in a lot of the developing markets here as well. So again, that's the opportunity. This year, for the first time, we looked at trust in small businesses versus big businesses. One of the things we discovered was that in a lot of the emerging economies, big businesses are trusted much more than small. And in developed economies, the reverse is true. Our belief is, in the West, big companies, because of scandals, because of economic lack of progress, have lost a lot of trust, whereas small companies, sometimes family-run companies, are perceived to have values and somehow be more trustworthy. The opposite is true in markets like China, where big companies are perceived to go where to get great training, to have a career. They're viewed as professional, exciting, international. Small companies, family companies in a lot of these markets are often seen as slow, old-fashioned, corrupt, nepotistic. Japan, as you can see, actually is in the middle in this regard. This is a slide of trust. Do you trust NGOs to do what is right? This is last year in green, this year in blue. And here you can see the ranking. Globally, NGOs are the most trusted institution in the world. So globally, if you end up in an argument with an NGO and you're a company, you don't have better data or better argument, you will lose. They're more trusted than you are. But look at the score for Japan. And remember what I said at the beginning, that in Japan, NGOs are only the third most trusted institution in any case. Media. This is the same for media. So do you trust media to do what is right? Last year in green, this year in blue. And here again, you can see that media in Japan is down on the distrusting end on the right. One of the things you might notice here is, do you trust media to do what is right? And you've got two countries here on the far left, Singapore and China, where media is government-owned and pretty much state-run, and yet highly trusted. And yet, on the other side, you've got US and UK, two free media markets, where media is not trusted. So why is that? And one of the things we've discovered with trust over the years is that trust is a very relative term. In Singapore, in particular, the media is perceived to have a role in nation building. And they don't have the same expectations as they would perhaps in the US, where media almost has a constitutional expectation to hold government and business to task. It's different. People answer the same question with a different value set. The other thing we believe, and this has come out of focus groups when we've looked at it afterwards, I'm from the UK, I used to be a journalist. In the UK, there are 11 national newspapers. If I went out and got a story that was the same as the other 10, my editor would give me a good kicking. That's not what they want. They want a different angle on the same story. That forces journalists in many of the three media markets who are highly competitive to sensationalize and to politicize. People in a lot of these countries buy their newspapers based on their political beliefs. Look at the Fox, the politicization of media in the US. Paradoxically, free media has meant that media is not trusted in a lot of the Western countries, whereas in China, there are a few of the stories the government are interested in, but most of them are pretty much straight reported. Dull reporting, I think, but pretty much straight reporting. So, interesting there. So you can see where Japan is on this. Japan fits much more the developed model here. We've now looked at credible sources of information. So if you're in a company and you're worried about and thinking about building trust, what are the credible sources of information about, or channels of information about your company that you need to look at? And the answer is that in all markets, and here in Japan, you have to have a communications plan that goes across all the different types of media. Encouragingly, for our media panelists who will be here in a minute, I know, traditional media is the most credible source of information on companies here in Japan. Search and social media is rising, however. It's a skeptical nation. We ask the question, how many times do you need to hear something before you believe it to be true? 89% of Japanese need to hear something 3 times before they believe it's true. That's not massively dissimilar to the global picture, actually. But what is different is the answer to the question of 15% have to hear something 10 times. That's an unbelievable level of skepticism. And that is different here. Okay, the crisis of leadership. Sources of information on a company. So if a company or organization is looking to increase trust, who needs to communicate and who needs to tell the story? Here in Japan, it's a bit different to some of the other markets. A technical expert or an academic are the most credible sources. Look at where the CEO is. Only 22% think that the CEO is the most credible source of information on a company. The biggest mover in Japan is a person like myself. You remember when I showed you the history of the trust study, 2005, 2006, is democratization of trust. A person like myself as a source of information. In 2005, 2006, that had passed Japan by. Japan was still very authoritarian, believed in authoritarian figures for credible sources of information. That's no longer the case. Whether it was what happened 2 years ago or the fact that social media is now much more widespread, people go to each other as credible sources of information on a company now, much more in Japan than in the past. And this, again, graphically, you can see what happened after 3/11 here. Credibility of all spokespeople in Japan, unbelievable decline. We had never seen numbers like this before. Understandable last year, we felt, given what happened. Puzzling to us that there's not been that bigger response this year. This is looking again at business and government leaders, and this is the credibility of the leaders in each of these markets. And here again, you can see where Japan sits. There's not a big difference, so it sits in the middle. But in absolute terms, credibility of business and political leaders is at record lows in Japan. We asked about why people weren't trusting business leaders and government leaders, and we gave people 5 choices. Do you think they are good at solving social or societal issues, correcting issues within an industry that's experiencing problems, making ethical or moral decisions, and telling the truth, even when that's a difficult thing to do? And business leaders scored pretty badly in Japan on these counters. Political leaders scored terribly on these counters. The path forward. So what do we make of all this? Firstly, let's just look again at the difference between, because this is different for Japan than it is for other markets as well. The top bar in this slide is the credibility of business as an institution on the left and government as an institution on the right. And then the light blue or the light red bar is trust in the leaders to tell the truth. And there's a big gap in all of these. Interestingly, the gap between them is much smaller in Japan. Maybe that's because in Japan, the idea of the hero CEO hasn't become as well embedded, or the hero political leader hasn't become so well embedded as it has in the West. What does all that mean for organizations, and where can they go, and how can you rebuild trust? Well, a number of years ago, we looked at the ingredients or attributes of trust. And we did a piece of research looking at around the world at what people had said made up trust, and then we went and we asked people to rank them around the world, and we ended up with these 16 attributes of trust. And I won't read them, you can see them there, but things like listens to customers, ethical business practices, high quality products or services, all the usual things that you would think. And we had a much longer list, and we went out and tested it, and globally this came back as the most important 16 ingredients. And we've just grouped them here into the 5 areas that we think are important: engagement, integrity, products and services, purpose, i.e. what does your business do or organization do other than make money, and operations. Are you successful? Do you make good products? Do you make a profit? And a number of things have changed over the years. In 2008, when we looked at these trust drivers, the operational, this is before the crash, before Lehman's, the operational aspects were much more important. If your company made good products and made a decent profit, generally it was trusted. That's not the case anymore. Look how much operations has been relegated compared to the other clusters of attributes. Things like engagement, integrity. These things are much more important now than they were a few years ago. The world has changed in terms of how people view organizations and how those organizations need to build trust. This is those 16 attributes listed in rank order for Japan. So the most important attribute to building trust in Japan is takes responsible actions to address an issue or a crisis. Well, I guess issues and crises are still fairly fresh in everybody's mind here. High quality products or services, transparent and open business practices, listens to customers and feedback, treats employees well, communicates frequently and honestly on the state of the business or the organization. So, and you can see what the rest are. Those are the most important 5 attributes. The second bar below is what people perceive the performance against those to be. And there is a big gap. Now, it's an unfair question because there's always a gap. People will always say, look, you're performing less than I expect. But this is a pretty big gap in Japan. We put this up because we believe any organization looking to build trust, this is your roadmap. If you can begin to address these 16 attributes, and in this order we would suggest in Japan, you'll make progress. I won't do that one. So to conclude, not that long ago, people in our business used to talk about the pyramid of authority, that we would communicate down from the top via authority figures, and it would cascade via broadcast media and big media to a grateful population who would receive the messages and information and believe it. And that just doesn't exist anymore. We believe now that that triangle has been replaced by a diamond, and that you have to do bottom-up as well, that you have to engage social activists, action consumers, who do score highly here in Japan, and employees as well, if you are to regain trust. To summarize, we're suggesting that distrust and skepticism is now a fundamental part of the trust profile in Japan. This is the second year. The bounce was small. I know there's been elections since we've done this study, but that would only take government up, not business, NGOs, and media. Second year, is it the new normal? Leaders in Japan have to adopt a much more inclusive, transparent, and consistent communications approach if they want to address that. And the erosion of Japan premium provides opportunities potentially for foreign companies here in Japan. And trust in Japanese companies overseas remains high, but Japanese companies need to communicate much better in developing economies to make sure that they get the benefit of that. So that's our data. I think I'm to hand over to someone. Thank you.